Good afternoon, everyone. Thanks for joining us for today's virtual office hour. My name is Cassandra McGee, a Senior Program Manager with JFF, and we're happy that you joined us for today's discussion regarding apprenticeship funding and policy considerations. We'll be touching on some federal policy updates. As a reminder, this is a recording session, so if you're not the primary speaker, please ensure your phone is muted for best call quality. However, we always welcome your input, your questions, that you can feel free to pop those things in the chat or come off of mute and have a discussion with us during the live question and answer session. This is part of the Youth Apprenticeship Works, which is a project with the Youth Apprenticeship Intermediaries funded by U.S. Department of Labor. Our special guest and presenter today is Eric Sells, Senior Advisor with JFF, who also oversees our work through the Center for Apprenticeship and Work-Based Learning. Thanks again for joining us. And with that, I'll go ahead and turn it over to Andrea Messing-Matthew, who's the director of JFF. Andrea?
Hi, everybody. Thanks so much for joining us. We'll jump right in here in just a second. I just wanted to remind everyone, this is part of our community of practice, our opportunity for us to see each other when seeing each other in person is not always so feasible. So we thank you all for joining us. And if you have any questions about Youth Apprenticeship Works, please reach out to Cassandra after the session is done. So Eric, I will pass it to you.
Thanks, guys. Sorry, I have to move. Good afternoon or good morning, everyone. I know we have folks from all over. So I plan on talking for about 10 or 15 minutes and sort of overview, and then really happy to open it up for questions. Cassandra, if you can facilitate that, that would be great. I guess we want to talk a little bit today about policy and what's going on at the federal government level, or in Congress, I should say. Also, what's going on over at the Department of Labor, anywhere else in the administration that we're hearing about interesting things happening. Maybe a future one we can talk about states, but we'll talk a little bit about federal policy, DOL, and what's going on up at the Hill. And the slides I'm going to show you probably need to be updated because it's typical in DC. Wait 5 minutes and it could change, right? And there seems to be a lot going on right now, changing in apprenticeship. And just if I can just recap for a minute, for a lot of you folks, just an apprenticeship in general. So we know for the last 100 years in this country, apprenticeship has been mostly in the building trades and labor unions to a large degree, not exclusively, but to a large degree. And then in the last, most of the programs were in building trades, probably 70, 80, 90%, depending upon the year. And then things started changing. And things started changing since 2015 during the Obama administration, where the Obama administration looked at everything that was good about apprenticeships and all of the data and said, well, geez, if they do such a good job of that in building trades and manufacturing and some of these, tool and die, crane operators, elevators, and some of those traditional programs, why can't you take the same model and use it elsewhere? And that's what's been going on since 2015, since 2015. So there's been, and let me just take you back to make this point about funding. So the national apprenticeship system, the federal apprenticeship system, for the last many, many years up until 2016 was funded at $27.5 million a year. That is a rounding error in federal funding. And it was 27 million, which is nothing in federal funding, to manage an entire national system. So now a major priority of apprenticeship came out through the Obama administration, continued through the Trump administration, is continuing to the Biden administration. Congress got into it in 2016, I think it was 16, was its first congressional appropriation of 90 million. And then it's done nothing but go up since 2016. It went up to 100 million, 145. Anyway, this year it's going to be 235 million. So it's a long jump from the original 27 million of just 7 years ago, right? And so that's the initial appropriation that the Department of Labor is going to be getting this year, is 235 million. So it is out of that, for the most part. They do a lot of their grant programs. So the ABA grant that is out there now, Building, America, Apprenticeship Building America, that grant program, and any of the other youth apprenticeship grant programs. If it's an apprenticeship grant program, for the most part, it's coming out of that federal appropriation of 235 million for this year. There's also an opportunity for that you all are probably well familiar with the H-1B funds. I don't know where that stands for this year. They've been sort of quiet about that, but I know in years past, H-1B funds, a different funding stream, has been used to drive apprenticeships. So the American Apprenticeship Initiative came out of that as well. And then the other funding that's come around for you folks who work at the state levels, SEAII grants and other state funding. So, prior to 2015 or 16, just so you know, there was, if you weren't around then, although most of us probably were, very little, if any, funding to states. And state apprenticeship agencies got little to no funding. And so all that has changed in the last 7 or 8 years. So that's good news. So under that framework, I want to talk a little bit about what's going on today and how the policy of that is impacting what's going on in practice. Next slide, please, Cassandra. I assume you're driving. Let's see. So these activities that are going on now, besides the $235 million, I'm sure you all know about the infrastructure fund, Build Back Better, workforce and national apprenticeship legislation. And I'll talk about the national apprenticeship legislation soon. And as many of you know or should know, WIOA, Workforce Innovation Opportunity Act, is being marked up as we speak in Congress. And you can use WIOA funds to drive training, work-based learning, OJTs, any of those sort of activities. So without getting in a lot of this detail on Build Back Better, there's a lot of infrastructure money there. You hear these really big numbers about $3.5 trillion or 100 million or 50 billion going into apprenticeship. I don't know where that landed since December, because this is an older PowerPoint that I'm using here, but there is a lot of money coming our way from several of those initiatives on the infrastructure funding, Build Back Better. And there's another one that's going to be voted on in a couple of weeks. So I'm blocking on its name, but it'll come to me shortly. So, in addition to that money, just look for a lot of other apprenticeship money coming our way, which will, for the most part, come through DOL. I mean, I think you may have seen at Commerce had some really big grant programs coming on recently where you could do apprenticeship. That was from the infrastructure money. So it can come through other federal departments, but for the most part, it'll be DOL. Next slide. I'm not going to even get into community college. They're not doing free community college, and things are changing with student debt, where the president now wants to do that. But in any event, you can see farther down here under the 78 billion, how much was planned or hopeful to go into WIOA, 5 billion into apprenticeships. Now, if that ever happens, that's a huge amount of money. Sector partnerships are being written in again to WIOA. And so sector work is an important thing for this administration, focusing on industry sectors and industry subsectors. So these are massive amounts of money, that could all be coming in the future, but that's not determined or set yet. Next slide, please. I guess, I guess I don't, there's a lot of things floating. I'll just continue to say there's a lot of things floating around that aren't determined yet. The biggest ones that we should pay attention to, besides the federal appropriation, the congressional appropriation of the 235, there is also the, what's it called? The National Apprenticeship Act, right? You all have probably heard that the National Apprenticeship Act has been approved by various levels, kind of on a bipartisan level, not really. And the question is that going to be passed in this upcoming set of bills that are in there? Rumor has it that it could be. Rumor had it last year that it couldn't be, but it seems to be moving and getting some support. So keep an eye out for the National Apprenticeship Act. I think I'll talk about that in a little bit more detail later. Next slide, please. They're working on reauthorization now. I think the biggest thing to understand here is not so much what's in the bill, although that's important. And you could go to, um, the House and Senate websites to look into that. And really, you could weigh in probably now because they were marking it up last week and probably today. Um, a lot of interest in sectors and career pathways, of course, and how WIOA can tie better to work-based learning. I mean, the biggest takeaway from this is, and I weighed in on this last week with some folks, which is um, you can use WIOA money for apprenticeships. It doesn't say you should or you must. So it's really up to the local board or the state board to drive that. So, I think there could be stronger language to encourage people to use WIOA dollars for apprenticeship, particularly for younger youth, the 18 to 24 out of school and out of work. Um, uh, there's a few workforce boards and others that do take up on this, but not a lot. And so I wish there was stronger language, but there isn't. But in your local area, you can talk to your workforce folks and see if they're willing to do something right. I mean, anything that's approved is allowable doesn't mean you have to do it. And that's the biggest challenge with workforce boards at the state and local level is unless they make a commitment at their board level or their staff level to say, yes, we're going to do apprenticeship, they don't have to use WIOA money for it. So it's always good to encourage those folks in your jurisdiction to use WIA money for this. It's not all that easy to do, but it's also not all that complicated. You could do OJT contracts. You could just use it as a training provider dollars, number of different ways to do that. And we have some other documents on that that I could also share with you at another community practice session. Next one, Cassandra, please. So the National Apprenticeship Act was put out last year. They took a bunch of comments. There's been some changes to it. There's been hearings on it, but it's been reintroduced this spring and passed in the House, and the Senate hasn't acted on it yet. There's no such things as IRAPs anymore. Those were taken out, which was a sticking point. Some people wanted it in or not. But the bottom line with National Apprenticeship Act is there's, I think, $400 million that comes with it immediately. There is some structure, a lot of structure. So let me back up. You know that our current apprenticeship system has a National Apprenticeship Act or the Fitzgerald Act passed in 1937, have not been massive changes to it. This would be a massive change to the act that governs all apprenticeship, right? So it's going to include a lot more focus on youth and a lot more structure on youth. There is not a separate youth apprenticeship title. There is not a separate youth apprenticeship program. Never has been. What this does is gets us closer to that with a section on youth apprenticeship and funding for youth apprenticeship, which I know is your interest. So something will undoubtedly happen there if that gets passed. There's also a big chunk of money for the standard regular adult apprenticeships, but it also gives a little bit more structure to DEI work, not just go out and get DEI. It tells you, communities to include and provides a little bit more structure about that, more structure about youth apprenticeship, more structure about evaluation and data collection, which I know is a challenge and sore point for many of you on the call. But I really am happy about the focus on youth apprenticeship because it really does sort of bring that up. There's also a focus on pre-apprenticeship, which I know comes up in a lot of our conversations that we have. So National Apprenticeship Act is something to look at closely. I have not looked at the most recent iteration. I'm sure you can go to the House or the Senate web pages to get it, or we can find a link to send it to you. It may even be at the end of this presentation. I'm not sure, but that will be the biggest change in apprenticeship, I think, in the last 83 years since the original one was passed. So look out for that. And it'll be traditional registered apprenticeships. It will not support anything that is non-registered. Very important point. Next slide. Yeah, I guess, this is just on terms of federal policy on work-based learning. There's a lot of interest in it. There's still not a lot of good identification of what it is. But in the education bills and in CTE related things and higher education act and all of these things, whether it's K through 12 or even community colleges or not, work-based learning it's a lot more than an honorable mention, as this slide indicates. There is just a lot of interest in expanding that. And, with that, there's a responsibility on our end as practitioners to be able to explain what work-based learning is. I mean, work-based learning covers the whole range of experiential and work-driven learning, including registered apprenticeship. But work-based learning can mean a lot of different things, right? It could be a non-registered apprenticeship, it could be an internship, it could be an externship, it could be a lot of different definitions. But the real problem with our public system and work-based learning is there's not one definition, there's multiple ones. And people have trouble reporting on it because they don't know what the contours of that. So it would be great if the federal government did a little bit more crafting around work-based learning or other alternatives to apprenticeship. Mostly you've got to customize and craft that where you are. Some states have done a little bit more on work-based learning. And so, check around in your state to see what's up. But there could be a little bit more focus. We think all experiential learning is good, and it is. So, we think registered apprenticeship is the best, but there are other forms that are certainly acceptable. Next slide. Is there another slide? Perfect. I probably went on too long, and I apologize for that, but certainly happy to take any questions, or I'd love to learn if there's anything going on in your states particularly, or questions about what's going on at the federal level. Happy to take any questions if you have time for that. Sandra, I'll kick it back to you.
Excellent. Thank you so much, Eric. And so I see that basically we have some other people that have joined us. So if you have any questions or comments about policies or funding for youth apprenticeship or registered apprenticeship, now is the time to join that discussion. Andrea, so you came back on camera.
I just was off camera. I find sometimes when the presentation is on camera, it can be tricky. So Eric, one of the questions that we often get is about blending and braiding of funding. So, that's, I think from a local, thinking about kind of what local funding is available versus kind of the more national funding. Are there any limits to the blending and braiding of funding that folks should just be genuinely aware of?
Yes, but we probably don't have much time to go into it. I mean, you've got to know what the rules are, right? So, there's a couple of things that this brings up, Andrea, that we've talked about before. So, one is, is this co-enrolling sort of thing, right? That can you co-enroll with other federal funds on apprenticeship? Yes, you can under certain circumstances and certain funding streams, and you have to be aware of what the rules are on that, or better off, if you're going to blend and braid money for an apprenticeship program, either check with your state apprenticeship agency or check with your federal regional office, particularly if you have a grant or a contract. That's easy to do. But for most things, you can enroll as long as you don't pay for the same service in the same activity in the same service. So if somebody covers the training and you're covering a portion of support services, that's fine. You can both take credit if it's the right funding stream. But to your question, Andrea, which is the more important question, is blending and braiding. So that's really a good question. It's, everybody encourages blending and braiding, and I'm not sure I know the difference between the two, although it's been explained to me over the last 20 years of my career about 100 times. I'm still not sure I understand it. But using other funds can be a good thing. It can also be a tricking thing. So like matching funds and leveraging are two different things. If with federal funds, you just have to be careful that you're following the right rules. So if you're going to support a federal grant that you're doing, you're going to leverage some other state funds or philanthropic funds or WIOA funds. I think for the most part, DOL and other funders want to see you leverage money, right? Want to see you engage other funding streams to make it happen. You certainly don't want to be duplicative, but everybody's going to have some different rules about that, the braiding and the blending of money. So you've really got to check what is your funding source, and it's better to sort of check with if you're using federal funds, to check with your Fed to make sure you're following it. But I think the short answer is, yeah, blending and braiding is a good thing as long as you can leverage it, as long as you're not supplanting other federal funds, and it's supporting a different piece of the work than you're already doing with the Feds. That's really a long-winded answer where I didn't say much, quite honestly, Andrea. But the issue is really just asking questions at the local level before you pull the trigger on them. You won't get in trouble that way.
Sounds like a plan. I want to make sure folks have a chance to ask Eric any questions about either past policy or current policy, current funding questions you might have.
And while people are thinking, Andre, I'll just say this. So, I mean, how this will all come out to impact you all on the call is most likely going to be grant programs, as I mentioned previously, right? And so it could be a New York grant. It could be, and I don't know what they are. You can go to DOL's website. They have funding opportunities listed out for the year as much as they know them. So you can look at that at DOL to get a sense of what's coming up. But it'll be other grant programs. And the Department of Transportation is releasing some of that infrastructure now. So also look at the Department of Transportation, Department of Ed, and Commerce.
Okay, I wanted to make sure I gave folks some chances. So one of the things that I am always curious about, Eric, is, and this is something that comes to us in questions across the country, are there particular ways that policy plays out with new industries? So industries that maybe aren't typical to the apprenticeship system. So whether it's clean energy or it's teacher education. Are there ways in which the policy landscape is either aiming towards those industries or maybe a little bit away?
Well, yes and yes. I mean, you know, and sometimes it's works really, really well, and sometimes it doesn't. I'm going to give you an example of what doesn't work. During the Great Recession back in 2010, 2011, they did all these green jobs, right? It was going to drive everything, and the feds put out a ton of money without the labor market information, and we all did grants on that back in 2010, 11, and 12. A lot of us got hosed in it. We trained a lot of people, but that green economy wasn't there, right?
Mm-hmm.
Uh, but I would say that a lot of that is influenced. And when I say by lobbying, I mean good lobbying, right? There's a lot of industries out there who are saying to Congress, look, you know, the alternative energy industry, the renewable energy industry, it's changing. There's stuff happening. There is demand for jobs. We're not, you know, we're flat-footed with workers, so we need to invest in them. Probably the best example is the Biden administration's 90-day trucking challenge, right? In 90 days, you know, the administration said we want to crank up the number of apprenticeships in the trucking industry, and they had some sort of goal that just wrapped up, and they met that goal, right? So that was influenced by industry. You hear a lot about the supply chain challenges that the administration is facing. And they have a particular focus on that. So yeah, industry does focus on it. You know, manufacturing could start leaning on them. In some places, educational institutions are saying, hey, we have a shortage in teachers. What can we do with apprenticeship? Or we have a shortage with, you know, in certain industries. So yes, and I would say the new industries you know, in the energy industry are probably going to be very opportunities, if you will, be very good opportunities. But that could happen in just about any industry. You know, manufacturing continues to be of interest to folks. Healthcare continues to be an interest to folks, given the aging population and post-COVID world and all that. So yeah, and I mean, and you know, now IT, and now, you know, I mean, this is another example. It's not exactly policy, Andrea, but it's, you know, to your point, there's a lot of concerns about, gee, are there women and people of color in the IT and the STEM industries, right? How can we engage more of that? So while those aren't directly industry related, they're driven by something else. That sort of influence in public opinion and academia can certainly influence that. And I would say to the people on the call, right, any sort of things they want to talk about, now's the time to call your congressional office or Senate office, or drop them a quick letter telling them what you want to see in a bill, what you want to see in apprenticeship. Apprenticeship is such a popular subject up on the Hill that I'm sure they'd love to hear from folks on this call.
Absolutely. So folks, we have like 1 or 2 more minutes. I'm just curious if there are any like burning questions that folks might have about either policy or funding, or how the funding works at the local level. Now would be a great time to ask that question.
So this is Matt. I might have one as it relates to Eric's thoughts on sort of synergy between WIOA and the HR 447 of the National Apprenticeship Act. So apprenticeship is a good mechanism for incumbent upskilling as well, right? So it's this new hire transition, but it's a great way to upskill people in a career. We've looked at some of the language and started to ask questions about WIOA incumbent worker training, and if there's not a way to make some alignment with apprenticeship. And curious if you've heard thoughts or if there's any momentum in that space, because WIOA is interesting because somebody can be underemployed but employed and not eligible for apprenticeship upskilling. So that it might be a fascinating way to blend or see the two worlds collide.
Well, if it doesn't say you can't, you should try it, right? That's, there's very clear language in some of these bills that say you must, you should, or you can, right? And, incumbent worker, I mean, Matt, I think incumbent worker apprenticeships is one of the, a few underused strategies that are out there, to say the least. But if I'm understanding your correction right, yeah, you can do upskilling. It's good to take entry-level production workers and to advance them, but you can do upskilling, you can do apprenticeship with incumbent workers. The challenge that DOL got into a couple of years ago, this predated me, but it's sort of saying, oh, well, you've got to be really poor or real low-wage earner to do that, right? And I don't know what that language will be like with incumbent worker training now or in the new bill, but you have to look at what that language says. That will guide you a little bit. But incumbent worker training program, there shouldn't be too many reasons you can't do it with WIOA dollars. Now, a lot of the WIOA dollars too, you can use. People don't even think about it, right? So whether it's the OJT portion, whether it's paying for a semester at community college, or 2 semesters at a community college for the RTI section, or whether it's the supportive services, or what I like people to think about is that youth stream, right? The out of school youth stream that most all of the workforce boards have, that they could use more for youth style apprenticeships. It is a bit challenging to use it for a local workforce board, right? They've got to see how they can use it. It's sort of new to many of them, but there are some boards who have done it rather successfully, and you can do it. And most people don't realize that they can. So I would encourage it.
Well, thank you, Eric, for sharing this short amount of time with us. Thanks, everybody, for joining us. And thank you for joining us, as always, at the Youth Apprenticeship Works virtual office hour. If you would like more information on this, please reach out to Cassandra. She can get you hooked into our little network. Thanks so much, everybody, and have a great day.
Thank you, Andrea.